Hello, my babies. Welcome back to Argo. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 4, which is federalism, the idea that the national government and the state governments share powers. We're basically going to look at those types of powers and what those entail. All right. So, the Constitution, first of all, grants two types of powers to the national government: implied powers and express powers. Those powers together are known as delegated powers because they are delegated or given to the national government. Express powers are expressed directly in the Constitution. If you read the Constitution, they're in there word for word. So here's some examples of some express powers. Number one, it says in the Constitution that the Constitution or the Congress can provide an army and a navy. Congress can declare war. When's the last declared war we ever had? Can you think of it? If you said World War II, you would be correct. That is the last officially declared war we've ever had. Have we fought other wars? Yeah, but they weren't officially declared. They get to conduct foreign relations, working with other countries, establishing federal courts. There's more than just a Supreme Court. There's lots of different federal courts that take care of lots of different federal laws. They get to coin money. If you ever look at a dollar bill, you're going to notice that there's a place on there, whether it's like San Francisco, Chicago, Denver. There's 12 different places around the country that create our money. Now, implied powers are ones that come from the elastic clause that I taught you about in Chapter 3, where Congress can stretch their powers if it's seemed as if it's necessary and proper. So it's not directly stated in the Constitution, but it's implied that they can do so. Probably the greatest example, the easiest example to understand of an implied power was when Congress created the Air Force and the Space Force. Because when the Constitution was written in 1787, there weren't planes. There aren't rockets that could go into space. But it is implied that they could create things to protect us because it said they can provide an army and a navy. Now, reserved powers are powers that are given solely to the states. Here's some examples of the reserved powers. They get to administer elections. So each state gets to decide the times of the election, when to vote. They get to decide if they're going to have local ones, primaries, caucuses, that kind of stuff. We'll get to that later. But an easy example is sometimes states require you to have an ID when you vote. Some don't. They get to decide those things. They get to regulate intrastate commerce, which is trade within the state. So like the government of Illinois can tell Joliet and Plainfield how to regulate business and trade with each other, but they just couldn't tell them how they could regulate their trade with like Indiana. Public health and welfare, they can make all those different types of laws. One easy example to remember is that like helmets, for instance, in Illinois, they don't make you wear them on motorcycles, but some states like Michigan do. They get to decide on moral issues like the death penalty in marriage. For instance, we're one of the very few states left in the country that has the death penalty, or that got rid of the death penalty, Most states actually have it. They get to establish local governments. So if they wanted to make a new city, if they decided Plano and Sandwich should just be one city and combine them, Plainwich? Or what would they say, Plano, Sandwich? That would be awful, wouldn't it? We don't want that. So hopefully they never do it, but they could. Next, we're going to talk about concurrent powers. So concurrent powers are powers both the national government and the state governments have, and they can share together. So I'll give you some examples. Number one, taxes. If any of you have a job right now, if you make $10 an hour and you work 10 hours a week, you are not taking home $100. You're probably taking home maybe $90 because you're going to get taxed, not only by the federal government, but by state governments. And state governments can decide what types of taxes to do. We have income taxes, other states don't. We have sales taxes, other states don't. So but the national government can tax us, as can the local and state governments. They both can establish courts. State governments can establish state courts. The national government can establish federal courts. They both borrow money. Illinois is crazy in debt. So is the United States government. They're borrowing money every day. On average, what do you think? How much money do you think the national government borrows every day? Think of a number in your head and see how close you are. The answer is $4 billion a day they borrow. Because we're like, just 22 trillion and change in debt, no big deal. Next, they can spend money for the general welfare, so just spending. A good example is education. Most money for education actually comes from local taxes and state taxes, but the national government every now and then can spend money on education. A good example would be with the COVID pandemic. The national government passed the CARES Act, which one of the parts of it is you can apply for a federal grant to get Chromebooks or laptops for every student at a school. We actually got one of those grants, so it was from the federal government. They can enact and enforce laws. So like at the state level, the people that enforce the laws would be cops or police. And at the national level, the people that enforce laws are the FBI. All right, the next part I'm going to talk about is Article 4, the relationships among states, how they have to relate to each other. In Article 4, it tells that how states need to help each other, and the three ways they do that are the full faith and credit clause, the privileges and immunities clause, and extradition, which is returning a criminal to the state they fled from. All right, Article 4, Section 1 is the full faith and credit clause. This says that each state has to recognize the laws, records, and legal proceedings of other states for civil law, meaning anything that's a dispute, not necessarily like something illegal. So like divorce, if you're suing someone, contract, breach, whatever. So I'll give you probably the easiest example to understand. Let's say you're driving through Indiana and you're going 20 miles over the speed limit. If they pull you over and they ask for your license, they have to look at that and give full faith and credit that it's legit. They can't be like, ooh, you're from Illinois. I don't think this is a legit license. They have to say it's legit. They have to. Next is privileges and immunities. So if you go to another state, you should expect that you get the same privileges that the citizens who live there get. Now, there are some exceptions to the rules. I'll go over those in a minute. But some examples of things that you get if you go to another state, those privileges, you can pass through it. They can't stop you at the border and say, nope, can't come in. Even though they've kind of been doing that with COVID, but I think that kind of stopped. You have the right to live in that state. So if you know anyone in your family or you have that, or they have a second home somewhere else, they have the right to do that. You can use their court, buy, help, sell, and hold property, and get married. I'm sure you guys know someone who's had a destination wedding outside of Illinois. That's totally allowed. But they can prevent us from doing other things. So you can't go and vote in another state. You can't take a trip up to Wisconsin and try to vote in one of their elections. It's not allowed. We can't attend their K-12 schools, the public schools, because you have to live in a certain area to attend those schools. You can't just go up to Wisconsin and be like, yeah, I'm going to Madison High School. And they'll say, no, you can't. You don't live here. We don't serve on their juries. We can't do that. I'm sure you guys are really upset about that. And you can't use their state hospitals. Now, that sounds kind of weird. If you have insurance, yeah, that's fine. But if you don't have insurance, they can deny you, because if you don't have insurance and you go in and you can't pay for anything, who foots the bill? The state taxpayers. So they could say, no, we're not letting you in because you don't pay taxes in the state. All right. So extradition is the third part. If a criminal flees one state, that the state that they go to must return them. So let's say Johnny kills someone in Arizona and flees to California. California is responsible for returning him or extraditing him back to Arizona to stand trial. So who's in charge of this? Whose job is it to return them? The governor. Now, if they flee to a different country, that country can decide if they return them or not. That country is not necessarily responsible and doesn't have to return them. That's sovereignty. They have the right to rule themselves. They don't have to do what the United States tells them. So, for instance, Edward Snowden, if you guys have heard of him, he was the guy that worked for the government who basically revealed some stuff, and that was illegal. He was breaching national security. He fled to Russia, and Russia is, we don't really get along with Russia, and they're not returning him. They're like, nah, we don't have to listen to you yet. The last thing I'm going to talk about is interstate commerce, agreements between two or more states. They can work on border disputes, pollution, development. I put the highway up here. Let's say Iowa and Illinois want to fix the bridge that goes over the Mississippi River. That would be an interstate compact that they would create to budget that out and see who does what. But there obviously can be fights with this. So if there are disputes between states, who settles them? The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will take care of any disputes between states. And if the states ever argue or have a dispute with the national government, Supreme Court will look at it, but the national government always wins. Why? The Supremacy Clause. All right. So after this, what I want you to do is work on the matching worksheet. It's on Google Classroom. You're just going to look at the powers and find the definitions and the examples that go with those powers. Have a great day. See you later.